Most people will never be wealthy, not because they can't be, but because they don't understand how wealth really works. They confuse money with wealth, effort with effectiveness, and comfort with progress. Most people believe that working harder is the key to becoming wealthy. They assume that if they put in more hours, grind longer, or hustle harder, they'll eventually reach financial success. But that belief, while emotionally satisfying, is often misleading. In reality, wealth is not primarily the result of effort. It's the result of understanding how the world works and making decisions that align with it. This is a fundamental principle. Success is not about how much energy you expend. It's about whether that energy is applied effectively based on a realistic view of how things operate. The first step toward wealth is understanding the mechanics of it. Money doesn't come from effort alone. It comes from creating value. And value is a function of usefulness, not busyness. You can work 80 hours a week doing tasks that have no scalable impact and still struggle financially. Meanwhile, someone else can spend 10 hours designing a system, a product, or a service that solves a meaningful problem for thousands of people and generate wealth that continues growing long after they've stopped working. The key is seeing the difference between activity and effectiveness. The world doesn't reward effort, it rewards outcomes. And outcomes come from making decisions that are well aligned with reality. That means understanding cause and effect relationships. What actions produce results, what risks are worth taking, and how certain systems behave over time. This kind of clarity only comes when you train yourself to think independently, observe patterns, and reflect honestly on what works and what doesn't. Many people fall into the trap of working reactively. They follow the script they were handed. Go to school, get a job, climb the ladder, and assume that if they just follow the path with enough dedication, wealth will eventually follow. But the economy doesn't work that way. It rewards those who understand leverage, scale, and systems thinking. It rewards those who solve real problems more effectively than others. And most importantly, it rewards those who adapt when the environment changes. Wealth is also deeply connected to your decision-making system. If you're not consistently making high-quality decisions based on a solid understanding of your own strengths, the needs of the market, and the constraints of time, you're not going to build wealth no matter how hard you work. And making good decisions requires clear thinking. That means removing emotional bias, seeing things as they are instead of how you wish they were, and constantly updating your beliefs when faced with new information. It's uncomfortable for many to accept that effort alone isn't enough because effort feels noble. It gives a sense of control. But when you start to look honestly at results, you begin to see that some people work less and gain more. Not because they're luckier or more privileged, but because they've learned how to operate more effectively within the system. They've spent time understanding where real value lies, how to tap into it, and how to structure their lives to be aligned with those realities. That's not about intensity, it's about clarity. Once you understand that wealth isn't driven by effort alone, the next step is to see that it's primarily a function of how you think, specifically whether you think in terms of short-term reactions or long-term cause and effect. The people who consistently build wealth over time aren't just those who work efficiently, they're the ones who see how their present actions connect to future outcomes. They make decisions based on principles that compound. That ability to connect present behavior to future consequences logically, not emotionally, is one of the clearest differentiators between those who accumulate wealth and those who don't. Most people are caught in a loop of short-term decision-making. They focus on solving immediate problems without thinking about the second and third order consequences. For example, someone might take a high-paying job that consumes all their time because it feels like the right move financially. But if they don't stop to evaluate whether that job builds skills, creates future optionality, or fits into a broader system of leverage, they may find themselves stuck in a cycle of trading time for money with no clear exit. Short-term gain, long-term stagnation. It's a common pattern. Thinking in terms of long-term cause and effect requires stepping back. You need to pause and look at your life like a system. What are the consistent inputs you're making mentally, financially, relationally, and what are the outcomes they tend to produce over time? Are your habits compounding toward freedom and abundance or reinforcing dependence and constraint? It sounds simple, but very few people actually stop and run this kind of mental model. They get too caught up in urgency, in doing what feels necessary right now without questioning whether it aligns with where they want to be later. The reason this matters so much is because wealth, like most meaningful outcomes, is the product of compounding. But compounding only works when you're moving in a consistent, correct direction. If your decision making is erratic, switching strategies, reacting emotionally, constantly chasing new ideas, you interrupt the compounding process before it gains momentum. Long-term thinking gives you the patience and clarity to let that process work, to stay with a principle-based path long enough for the results to materialize. It's also important to understand that time is not neutral. Every decision you make either moves you closer to freedom or deeper into dependence. For example, spending money on liabilities because it gives a temporary emotional boost might feel harmless, but repeat that enough times and you create a lifestyle that requires constant income just to sustain. On the other hand, directing money into assets that produce cash flow or appreciation might feel slower and less exciting in the short term, but it sets in motion a flywheel that builds stability and optionality over time. Thinking in long-term cause and effect also helps you navigate uncertainty. You stop needing immediate validation or success because your thinking is grounded in probability and patterns. You're less reactive, more adaptive. You look at setbacks as data, not defeats, and you adjust accordingly. This kind of thinking isn't just more effective, it's more sustainable. It gives you the mental bandwidth to keep moving forward even when progress isn't immediately visible. And that, over time, becomes a major advantage. When you start thinking in terms of long-term cause and effect, you begin to understand that progress isn't linear, it comes in cycles, periods of success followed by challenges, mistakes, or setbacks. These setbacks aren't just unfortunate, they're inevitable. That's the nature of reality. But what differentiates those who move forward from those who stay stuck is how they handle those moments. A core principle that emerges here is simple but powerful. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Most people try to avoid pain when something goes wrong. They instinctively look for someone or something to blame, or they distract themselves to avoid facing the discomfort. But pain is actually a signal. It's your mind's way of telling you that there's a gap between how you expected the world to work and how it actually works. That gap is valuable. If you're willing to look at it directly, without ego, it becomes a tool for learning. The deeper the pain, the clearer the feedback. But only if you take the time to reflect on it. Reflection isn't just thinking about what happened. It's a structured process of analyzing the cause of the pain, what decisions led to it, what assumptions were wrong, and what principles need to be adjusted so it doesn't happen again. That's where the growth comes from. When you can look at your failures without defensiveness and break them down into clear lessons, you turn them into stepping stones. If you skip the reflection, you're likely to repeat the same mistake. And if you repeat the same mistakes over time, you compound failure instead of success. The process can be uncomfortable, especially if your identity is tied to being right or competent. But facing reality, especially when it hurts, is one of the most powerful things you can do to improve your decision-making system. Every painful experience, when processed correctly, gives you data. That data helps you refine your principles, and better principles lead to better outcomes. Let's say you make a poor investment decision. You lose money. The pain is immediate. The easy response is to blame the market or withdraw entirely. But the more useful response is to ask, what was my reasoning at the time? What did I overlook? Was I following a principle or reacting emotionally? If you document that process and revisit it later, you start to build a personal library of cause and effect relationships. That's what makes you better. Not the win, but the analysis of the loss. Over time, this method of reflection becomes a habit. You start seeing mistakes not as threats to your self-worth, but as necessary feedback loops. The people who advance the fastest are the ones who can metabolize failure quickly, learn the lesson, apply the correction, and move forward without letting emotion distort the signal. This is how personal evolution happens, not in the absence of pain, but in your willingness to engage with it rationally, break it down, and extract the insight. The process isn't always pleasant, but it's always effective. Once you begin treating pain as a signal and reflection as a tool, the next logical question becomes, what exactly should you be directing your time and energy toward? In other words, what actually produces income in a meaningful and sustainable way? The answer, grounded in both economic reality and personal experience, is that money flows to value. More specifically, it flows to those who can consistently produce something that is useful to others. Most people make the mistake of thinking about money in isolation. They ask how to get more of it without asking why someone would give it to them in the first place. That kind of thinking is disconnected from reality. Money doesn't appear randomly. It's exchanged for value. And value is created when you solve problems, meet needs, or make something more efficient, scalable, or accessible. That's the cause. The effect is income. Once you accept that principle, the focus shifts from money as a goal to usefulness as a function. If you want to earn more, you have to be more useful, either to more people in more valuable ways or with greater efficiency. Usefulness is the metric, but usefulness isn't determined by what you think is valuable. It's determined by the person on the other end of the exchange. If you're not solving a problem they care about, it doesn't matter how much effort you put in. The market is indifferent to your intention. It rewards relevance and results. This shift in thinking away from effort and toward value forces you to ask better questions. Instead of what job pays the most, you begin asking, what valuable problem can I solve? Instead of how can I make more money next month, you ask, how can I build a system that delivers value over the long term? These are fundamentally different paths. One leads to temporary gains and dependency on external structures. The other leads to leverage and independence. Solving valuable problems doesn't always mean creating something entirely new. It often means improving what already exists, making processes smoother or removing friction from someone's life or business. And the more your solution can be delivered repeatedly without needing your constant personal involvement, the more it scales and the more wealth it can generate. That's how systems outproduce individuals. It's also important to notice that not all work is equal. Some tasks are easily replaceable, while others require a unique combination of insight, experience, and execution. The more specialized and hard to replicate your contribution is relative to the problem it solves, the more valuable it becomes. So increasing your income isn't just about solving problems. It's about solving the right kinds of problems in the right ways. When you operate from this framework, you stop chasing money directly. You focus instead on increasing your capacity to create value at scale. You build feedback loops, track what's working, and refine your approach. The clearer your understanding of what others genuinely need and your ability to meet that need in a repeatable, efficient way, the more wealth becomes a byproduct, not the primary pursuit. This is the foundation of sustainable economic success. Once you understand that wealth is a byproduct of creating scalable value, it naturally leads to the question of how to increase the efficiency and impact of that value creation. That's where leverage comes in. Leverage is one of the most fundamental forces in economics. It's what allows small inputs to produce large outputs. Without it, your results are limited to the amount of time, energy, and effort you can personally apply. With it, you can multiply the impact of your decisions and actions far beyond your own individual capacity. The core principle here is straightforward. To build wealth faster than most people, you need to stop thinking linearly. Most people work in direct exchange, 1 unit of time for 1 unit of pay. That creates a hard cap. There are only so many hours in the day and only so much you can do yourself. Once you recognize that constraint, the goal becomes finding ways to separate your income from your time. Leverage is the tool that allows you to do that. There are different forms of leverage: capital, technology, systems, and people. Each one extends your reach. Capital allows your money to work for you instead of just working for it. Technology enables you to deliver value at scale with zero marginal cost. Systems give consistency and structure to your process, reducing the need for constant intervention. People bring skills and execution to areas where you don't have the bandwidth or expertise. Each form of leverage has trade-offs, but the logic is the same. Increase output without increasing your personal input proportional. In practice, applying leverage means looking at everything you do and asking whether it can be multiplied. If you're offering a service, can it be turned into a product? If you're solving a problem manually, can it be automated or delegated? If you're making decisions, can those decisions be encoded into a repeatable process? This way of thinking shifts your role from operator to architect. You stop being the engine of production and start designing the system that produces. A common mistake people make is clinging to control. They think doing everything themselves ensures quality or safety, but in reality, it keeps them stuck in a low leverage model. True control comes from designing systems that don't require constant oversight. That takes upfront effort, thinking, planning, testing. But once built, those systems create more time, not less. And that time can then be reinvested into building even more leverage. Leverage also compounds. The earlier you start applying it, the more time you give for that compounding to accelerate. A small piece of code, a helpful team, or a well-structured process might not seem like much in the beginning, but over months and years, the effect becomes exponential. That's how people make large leaps in wealth creation, not by pushing harder, but by pulling the right levers. So once you've developed the skill to create value, the next step is to ask, how can this value be delivered at scale with minimal incremental effort? That's the question leverage answers. And how effectively you answer it will determine how far and how fast you can go. As you begin applying leverage to scale your value creation, another critical reality comes into focus. Your results are limited by the quality of your decision making. Even with leverage, systems, or capital, if your decisions are flawed, the consequences scale just as much as the benefits. Poor decisions, when multiplied, produce bigger failures. So if you want to build sustainable wealth, you need to make improving your decision making a daily priority. The principle is simple. Better decisions over time lead to better outcomes. But good decision making doesn't come from intuition or guesswork. It comes from clear thinking, rational analysis, and a willingness to confront reality honestly. Most people think they're making rational choices, but what they're often doing is reacting based on emotion, assumptions, or social conditioning. These reactions feel right in the moment, but they frequently lead to poor long-term results. To avoid this, you need to operate with a mental model that separates what you feel from what's objectively true. That means slowing down when making important decisions, breaking them down into components, and identifying the key variables that will determine the outcome. You ask, what am I actually trying to accomplish? What are the second and third order consequences of this choice? What information am I missing? This kind of thinking isn't natural. It requires practice, but it's the foundation of consistently effective action. A big part of improving decisions is developing an awareness of your own biases. Everyone has blind spots. The challenge is to recognize them before they distort your thinking. For example, confirmation bias, where you only look for evidence that supports your existing belief, can lead to overconfidence and missed risks. Outcome bias, judging the quality of a decision based only on its result, can cause you to repeat flawed processes just because they occasionally worked. Learning to spot and correct these tendencies is one of the most valuable investments you can make in your own thinking system. Another principle to recognize is that decision-making is a skill, not a one-time event. Every decision is an opportunity to refine your process. It helps to treat decisions like experiments. Make your best judgment based on the information you have, track the outcome, and then analyze the result. If it worked, ask why. If it didn't, ask why. Over time, you build a set of internal rules, principles that guide your future choices more efficiently. These become assets that compound, just like capital. It also becomes clear that not all decisions are equally important. Some decisions, usually a small minority, carry outsized consequences. Identifying and focusing on these high leverage decisions is crucial. They require deeper analysis, more input, and a greater level of thoughtfulness. On the other hand, many routine decisions can be standardized, delegated, or even automated. Once the underlying principle is clear, this frees up mental bandwidth for the choices that truly move the needle. Ultimately, decision-making is the steering wheel of your life. If you're not constantly refining how you steer based on feedback, reflection, and data, then no amount of effort or leverage will move you in the right direction. What you repeatedly choose to do and how you choose to do it is what shapes your trajectory. Everything else follows from that. Once you start making better decisions and implementing leverage effectively, the next layer of growth involves understanding your own system and improving it over time. This requires stepping back regularly to evaluate what's working, what isn't, and why. In practical terms, it means building feedback loops and treating your life, your business, or your strategy like a machine, one that can be studied, adjusted, and improved. If you're not doing this consistently, you're likely repeating avoidable mistakes and leaving potential growth on the table. The principle at work here is iteration. Nothing works perfectly the first time, and no plan is immune to flaws. But most people treat their decisions as one-off events instead of as part of a broader process that can be refined. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to notice what's not working, isolate the root causes, and make calculated adjustments. That's how systems improve. You learn, you adapt, and you raise the reliability of your outcomes. To do this well, you need objective feedback. That's where tracking and data become essential. You can't improve what you don't measure. This doesn't mean obsessing over every number, but it does mean having clear indicators that reflect the performance of your system. Are your investments yielding expected returns? Are your efforts leading to meaningful results? Are your decisions producing the consequences you intended? If not, what variable needs adjusting? This kind of thinking requires intellectual humility. You have to assume there are things you're missing and be open to seeing them. When something doesn't go as planned, it's not just a failure, it's a data point, but only if you're willing to dig into it and extract the insight. Otherwise, the failure just becomes noise instead of a signal. Over time, if you ignore too many signals, your whole system becomes fragile, unable to adapt to change, unable to respond to new information, and ultimately unable to grow. It's also important to recognize that iteration is not just about fixing what's broken. It's also about scaling what works. Once a part of your system shows consistent results, it becomes a template. You can replicate it, expand it, or build on top of it. That's where compounding really takes effect. You're no longer guessing or starting from scratch. You're operating from a foundation of tested principle. In reality, very few people take the time to do this kind of iterative improvement. They either react impulsively to problems or keep repeating routines without examining their effectiveness. But the people who outperform over the long run are almost always those who treat their life like a dynamic system. constantly evaluating inputs, outputs, and the mechanics in between. They learn from every experience, not just emotionally, but structurally. They test assumptions, adjust variables, and watch the system respond. This approach takes effort, but it removes a lot of randomness from the process. You move from being reactive to being strategic. You stop hoping things will work and start engineering them to work. That shift, thinking like a designer of systems instead of just an operator within them, makes all the difference in the speed and reliability of wealth creation over time. The faster you accept reality and align yourself with how the world actually works rather than how you wish it worked, the faster you move toward meaningful success. Wealth isn't a mystery. It's a natural consequence of producing value, using leverage, making sound decisions, and continuously refining your approach through feedback. Most people are distracted, reactive, and emotionally driven. If you can train yourself to think clearly, act deliberately, and design systems that compound over time, you'll move ahead not by luck, but by inevitability. The path is hard, but it's not hidden. It's there for anyone willing to face the truth and follow the principles.